Our attention to upcoming schedule. All right, what I want to point out, of course, is, we're here in week 3, talking about competitive balance. Now, there is a paper reading for next class. I'd encourage you to take a look at that reading before next class. And I'll point out, upcoming important dates. We do have our midterm exam coming up October 8th, so we're now 1 month away from that midterm exam, so something to keep on your radars. Cool. Questions about anything before we jump into today's material? Okay. A quick look here at Canvas. We have slides for this week up here. That reading is here on Canvas, so if you're looking for that reading, it is there. And I'll point out that the Think, Pair, Share for this week, you're going to submit Wednesday's Think, Pair, Share, not today's. Okay. All right, cool. All right, so jumping into today's material. All right, can we come back together, please? Okay. I'm talking down here. Thank you. All right, cool. Okay, so we have a Think, Pair, Share to start the class, like always. 2 questions. Number 1, suppose Coca-Cola's competitors, like Pepsi or Dr. Pepper, all produced a very low-quality product. How would this affect Coca-Cola's demand and revenue? And explain. And then number 2, suppose Michigan's competitors, like Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, all produce a very low-quality product. How this affects Michigan demand, viewership, attendance, revenue. Explain. And like always, take a couple of minutes to think about this on your own. And then you're going to move into smaller groups, and we'll do our normal. All right, so okay, 2 minutes on your own. I will tell you when to pair up. Go ahead and pair up at this point if you haven't already done so. Go into your small groups. All right, I'm going to bring us back together. All right. We ready? Okay. Can I get a volunteer to answer number 1?
You said the Coca-Cola demand would shift to the right and revenue would go up because Coca-Cola products are substitutes for the other competitors.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So if Pepsi is not tasting very good, I'm going to buy Coca-Cola instead. Those goods are substitutes. Demand is probably going up for Coca-Cola if Pepsi starts producing a bad product. Did anybody disagree with that take on number 1? Okay, so how about number 2? Can I get a volunteer for number 2?
I said that Michigan's viewership would increase, but the attendance would stay the same. Obviously, the viewership is going to go up because if like more of their competitors put out a low quality product, fans are going to want to see a higher quality product more often than in Michigan in this situation. And then I said attendance would stay the same because the big house basically sells out every game anyway.
Okay. So view here is that potentially going up, attendance might stay the same because of, how about we focus on viewership here? So potentially viewership going up. Did anyone say anything different regarding viewership?
Well, we were talking about how these two could be considered almost complements because if Michigan's playing Alabama and Alabama's playing horrible, it's going to be the same as, like Michigan playing Bowling Green at that point. There's not many people to watch.
Yeah, so there's potentially something different about this Michigan football product than this Coca-Cola product, right? And that point of kind of joint production is the thing, right? So, okay, if we're thinking about what's going to happen if Alabama or Ohio State or Michigan State or whoever are bad, right? On the one hand, you might be more likely to watch Michigan's game if these other games are a low-quality product, right? But if it's the case that Michigan is good, right? So Michigan football is good, and everybody they play against is bad, right? In the short term, cool, maybe we win a championship or something, right? Over the longer term, right, if Michigan is good and the competitors are bad, you would expect viewership to eventually decline over time, right? Or maybe not, I don't know. I mean, if Michigan won every game 50-0, how many of you would watch each week? So raise your hand if you're still gonna watch on TV every week if they win each game 50-0. Okay, so some hands. How many of you would not watch every week if each game is 50-0? Yeah, so potentially a little bit of both, right? And let's imagine it's not Michigan, right? Maybe it's some other. You're a fan of college football, right? Alabama every week wins 50-0. Are you going to watch all of those games? How many would still turn on the Alabama game each week if they're winning 50-0? Okay, so we got a loyal fan potentially, right? How many would not watch the Alabama game if they know it's going to be 50-0? Yeah, and even more hands than if it's Michigan, right? But the point here is, right, there's something different about the sport product than there was about the other products, right? You know, these other products, if Pepsi is bad, that's unequivocally good for Coca-Cola, right? If Pepsi does not taste good, you're going to buy Coca-Cola instead if you want to buy soda, right? But with this sport product, if these other teams are bad, you might be less likely to want to watch your team, right? Can anyone think of any other product that is like sport in that sense? I mean, I can't, right? So in some ways, sport is kind of unique in this sense of like the quality of your competition might matter. And matter in kind of the opposite way as it does for other products. So that's going to bring us into, a review question, then we'll get into the topic of these slides. So a review question first. Consider the market for soccer cleats that's currently in equilibrium. Suppose the following two changes occur. One, new research suggests that participating in adult recreational soccer leagues is good for heart health. And then two, tariffs cause an increase in the cost of materials used in making soccer cleats. How will these two changes affect equilibrium in the market for soccer cleats? Take 30 seconds to draw your little graph and come to an answer. All right, I'm going to bring us back together down here at the front. Hands for choice A. Hands for choice B. Hands for C. Hands for D. Yeah, I'm thinking this should be A also. So if we look at these two changes, if participating in adult recreational soccer leagues is good for your heart health, we'd expect demand to increase. So demand is shifting right. And then if tariffs are raising the costs of materials, that's an increase in our input costs, we would expect supply to shift left. And that increase in demand, decrease in supply should lead to an increase in price. But what happens to quantity is ambiguous. We don't know. All right, and I'm going to quickly draw the graph for us just so we all can see it. So bear with me for a second as I pull up a whiteboard screen. Right, so what this graph here is looking like. Right, so we've got our initial downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. So again, price, quantity, demand, supply. So our initial equilibrium is here. And then we said demand goes up. So increase in demand or a rightward shift in the demand curve. And then a decrease in supply or a leftward shift here in supply. right? So new equilibrium is happening at this intersection between the two new curves. And very clearly here in this graph, right, the price is higher. Exactly what happens to quantity depends on how big those relative shifts are, right? Quantity could go up, could go down, could stay the same depending on which shift was bigger. Any questions on that? All right, cool. Okay. So moving back to the slides. Today we're going to talk about competitive balance, and actually this discussion will spill over into next class also. Competitive balance is a measure of how evenly matched teams are in a league. We're going to talk about exactly how we define this in later slides. There are a number of quantitative ways to measure competitive balance, but for now, this is a measure of how evenly matched competition is in the league. Right? The uncertainty of outcome hypothesis is the belief that demand for sporting events depends on the outcome of the event being uncertain. Or this is the idea that fans want to see a close contest. Or that is to say, we would expect more people to want to watch if they expect there to be more competitive balance or a more balanced outcome than if the outcome is certain. Questions so far? So again, competitive balance, how evenly or unevenly matched are teams. Uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, people want to watch more evenly matched contests. Questions? Okay. So what does the data say? Do fans actually care about balanced contests? Well, the empirical evidence is mixed. And to give an example from my own childhood, right? Fans certainly might like uncertainty, but they want to see their team win. When I was a kid, I grew up in upstate New York. I was a Yankees fan. We didn't have tons of money to go to New York City all the time to watch games, right? So if we went to a game, it would be like a game or two in a given year, right? And certainly not every year. When I went to games, I wanted to see the Yankees win, right? If I'm going to one game a year, I want to see my team win, right? So if we look at the empirical evidence, again, that's my own anecdotal evidence, I want to see my team win, right? Empirical studies have found that the optimal home win probability is between 60 and 70%, right? So studies using data suggest that fans don't actually want 50-50. They want more like 60-40, right? I want my team to win, but I don't want it to be too unbalanced. We don't want 50-50. We also don't want 90-10, right? I don't want it to be a sure win. I want a good game, right? So again, fans want somewhere between a 60 and 70% likelihood of their team or the home team winning. 50-50 is potentially not what we want. 90-10 also not good. For owners, competitive balance is going to matter if it impacts attendance, right? So owners of sports organizations want to make money, right? Owners care about competitive balance if it's affecting their pockets, right? So if fans don't attend, if the balance is too bad, that's a bad thing for the league. Questions so far? And to look at a little bit of data here, coming back to this question of the Yankees. Here we can see from 1950 to 1958, the American League champions, all but 1954, were the Yankees. So the Yankees won the American League every year except for 1954 over that 9-year period. The National League, on the other hand, had a number of different champions, right? Phillies win a year, a couple of years of the Dodgers, the Giants, the Braves, right? What we see during this period is that the Yankees' attendance was actually falling from that period. The Yankees drew in 2 million fans in 1950, down to less than 1.5 million in 1958. If we look at overall attendance in the American and National Leagues, American League attendance, where the Yankees were, actually fell during that period from over 9 million to just over 7 million. National League attendance during that time increased from just over 8 million to over 10 million, right? Again, some anecdotal evidence that fans liked seeing some level of balance potentially, right? Lack of balance in the American League, we see attendance going down for the Yankees and in the American League overall. Balance in the National League, we see attendance increasing. Questions on that? Again, just anecdotal at this point. Now, while we might want competitive balance, actually getting competitive balance can be challenging. And this little graph here gives us kind of a quick illustration. We haven't talked about profit maximization yet, and we will in some more detail next week. But the idea behind this graph is that teams in bigger cities can afford to buy more talent, right? And buying more talent for those teams gets them more revenue. Or that is to say, when the Yankees win an extra game, that's going to bring in more revenue for the Yankees than if, I don't know, the Milwaukee Brewers win an extra game, right? Or the Minnesota Twins, maybe, is the good example from this season, right? So if the big market team wins an extra game, that generates more revenue for the big market team than if a small market team wins an extra game, right? What we're seeing here in the graph is that the additional revenue coming in from winning is higher than the additional revenue coming in from winning if you're in a big market versus a small market. So in the absence of any rules put in place, big teams would want to buy more wins than small teams. Right? So team owners, if they could spend as much as they wanted to, the big markets would spend more than the small markets to try to buy wins, which probably makes some sense. Questions so far? So again, it's tough to have competitive balance because the forces at play would suggest that the big teams want to buy more wins than the small teams. I'm going to have us go out into another think, pair, share. I'm calling this a quick think, pair, share. There's just one question. So again, take your kind of similar approach to the think, pair, share. You're not going to go on your own. You're going to go into groups right away. One question: if I asked you to think about competitive balance in your favorite sports league, what would balance look like? So pick one league, and I want you to tell me what would balance mean in that league. And in describing what balance looks like, you might want to specify what time horizon you're talking about. So again, take a couple of minutes to break out into a group, talk about what balance would look like in your favorite sports league. All right, I'm going to bring us back together. Bringing us all back together. Okay, can I get a few volunteers? Someone want to volunteer? Earn yourself some bonus points.
Okay, so we talked about NBA.
Okay.
So the first one is reverse draft. So like each season, the team that has worst performance has the highest chance of like picking the greatest talent. That's the first one. The second one is revenue sharing. Like whenever the NBA gets like media deals for like in the national or international levels, they kind of redistribute the money back to the teams evenly, like preventing like teams like Lakers getting too much money compared to those teams from like small cities. And the third one is a salary cap. So like they're kind of limiting how much salaries you can pay for getting talent.
Thank you. And actually, those answers apply more to next class than this class. All I wanted here is what does balance mean? So those are all three good rules that might help with balance. But what does balance mean in the first place? Someone want to share what they think balance means in their league. So what would a balanced league look like?
Like we were doing the NFL, and to me, like competitive balance means that no single team dominates year after year. Those teams have a chance to win.
Okay, yeah. So the answer there for the NFL was not a single team is dominating year after year. So maybe different championships different champions year after year, right? So it's not the same team that is winning each season, the Super Bowl, right? Cool. Someone else want to volunteer their answer of what balance looks like?
I said perfectly competitive, or at least in like my like honest opinion, like a perfectly balanced league. I think you have like 5 or 6 teams that are like championship contenders. But I also think on the flip side, you need teams that are going to be bad, but you I wouldn't say know they're going to be bad, but you do need sort of that balance as well. I don't completely hate the idea of taking either, just because I do feel like long term it kind of helps with like making teams more competitive, or at least gives them a better chance to be competitive. And I don't think like trying to have every single team be competitive every single season is necessarily in their best like long term.
Yeah, so there's a lot there and a couple of pieces. So this question of time horizon looms big, right? One suggestion is you need at least a decent number of teams that could compete for the championship, right? So some decent number of competitors. But if we're thinking longer term, it might be good to have some teams that are not great this year, but could be better in the future because of the rules that might be in place to help. Cool. Other thoughts on what competitive balance looks like? Again, bonus points. You want to participate, bonus points. Yeah. Any other ideas on what competitive balance is looking like? There are lots of people talking. So what does balance mean? Is that a hand?
Would it be like when the NFL has the reverse draft order so that teams that lose have a higher chance of competing?
Well, so those are things that will help make balance, right? But what does it mean to have balance in the first place, or have imbalance, right? What does imbalance look like? Yeah.
We were talking about how like the Chiefs win Super Bowl every year. That's not competitive balance. Like we would like different divisions having Super Bowl champions every year. That would be more competitive.
Yeah, so definitely the same team winning the Super Bowl year after year is not balance. Absolutely. Yeah.
I would also say like salary caps, like being able to play players certain months, like a team like the Cowboys could pay, like could have paid Mike Parsons like he wanted, but instead
Yeah, so definitely, so things we need to think about clarifying, and we're going to get here within the slides, right, is what is balance itself, right, versus what are the things that help with balance, right? And right now, we haven't necessarily defined these things, so we're going to get there. There are definitely a lot of rules that help with balance. We need to define what balance is in the first place. Yeah. So, how do we measure balance? Well, depends on what we're talking about in terms of the time horizon. We could have what we refer to as interseason balance, so balance between seasons. And this is something that a couple of the answers that came up talked about, right? What does it mean to have balance between seasons? Well, do we have the same teams winning the championship year after year? Or do we have a different group of teams winning the championship year over year? Right? Balance would be different teams winning. Maybe it's looking at who's making the playoffs, right? Balance might be different teams making the playoffs year over year instead of the same group of 8 teams making the playoffs year after year or something, right? So that's interseason. There's also intra-season balance, which is within season. And within season, this is a question of, I don't know, do most teams win about half their games, right? Do you see a lot of teams that are pretty close with their records? Or do you see a couple of teams win most of their games and a couple of teams lose all of their games, right? So again, interseason, that's between seasons. Do you see different teams winning year over year? Interseason, that's within a season, sorry, intra-season, within a season, right? Are the teams pretty closely clustered in record, or are the records drastically different? Questions so far? So a knowledge check question here. In which of the following leagues do we see the most intra-season balance? So most balance within a season. And you can take a look at A, B, C, and D and take a second to think about your answer here. So again, where do we see the most intra-season balance? And again, when you're looking at these, there are like 4 teams in each of these leagues, right? So 4 teams, those are the records for those 4 teams. Okay, so let's run through this. Hands for A, hands for B, hands for C, hands for D. Yeah, I'd say D is probably the best answer here. And again, if we're looking at these choices, A is the worst, right? You've got that first team that won 36 of their 40 games. You've got that last team that only won 6 of their 40 games, right? So you've got some good teams, some bad teams in League A. If you look down to choices C and D, and actually C or D maybe could have been the right answer, but D is probably slightly better. You know, the best team in League D only won 25 of their 40 games. The worst team still won 13 games, right? Or maybe choice C. Again, both of these are pretty good answers. C or D could have been the right one, right? Again, League C, best team wins 26, worst team wins 14, right? But again, definitely more balance in League C and D, less balance in A and B. Questions on that? So again, in terms of intra-season balance, you've got, you know, fairly evenly matched competition potentially in C and D. Okay. Another one here. In which of the following leagues do we see the most inter-season balance? And again, take 30 seconds to look through these 4 answer choices, and I'll ask for hands. All right, hands for choice A, the WNBA. Hands for choice B, the NBA. Hands for C, the NFL. NFL. Hands for D, the NHL. Yeah, so should be B, right? And if we look at the NBA here, there have been 6 different champions over the last 6 seasons. Right? Actually, there's been 7 over the last 7, right? But if we look at these 4 leagues, NBA has had a different team winning each year in the recent past. Compare that to the NFL, where the Chiefs have won 3 of the last 6 Super Bowls, right? So again, balance here in the NBA, less balance in the NFL in the recent past. Questions on this? Okay. There are some other ways we might think about competitive balance too. We talked about inter-season, so that's across seasons. We talked about intra-season, that's within. Not as commonly talked about in sports economics, but some additional ways I like to think about this. Intra-game balance or within game balance. Are margins of victory small, right? Or do we see a lot of lead changes, right? So in my mind, there's good balance in a league if we're talking about basketball, if most games are decided by 1 possession, that's pretty good balance, right? Even if the Thunder win 80 games, if they're all really close games, those are good games in my mind. There's some balance there, right? Alternatively, if the winning team in basketball is winning by 30 points each game, that's not great balance, right? Or, similarly in football, right? Like if the typical game is decided by 1 touchdown, pretty good balance, right? If the typical game is decided by 3 touchdowns, probably not good balance, yeah? Might also think about intra-playoffs, so within playoff balance. Are playoff series long, right? Like if we've got a sport where you've got 3 or 5 or 7 game playoff series, right? Are most series decided in 4 games if they're 7 game series? Or do the series go 7 games, right? In my mind, 7 game series are competitive series. 4 game series are not competitive series. Questions on that? All right, cool. So again, how do we define balance? We've got a number of different ways to think about what balance might mean. In terms of how we actually do the measurements, we'll wait for folks to leave. Okay, so how do we actually measure competitive balance? The most popular way to measure intra-season balance is the Knoll-Scully ratio. This is a measure that's based on the standard deviation of win percentages within the league. If we're looking at teams across the league, we can simply calculate what is the standard deviation in those win percentages, right? So, if we know we got 30 teams in the league, we can calculate their win percentage, some measure from 0 to 100%. We can calculate that standard deviation. And if we're looking at the same league across years, we can just compare those standard deviations. So if the standard deviation is higher one season than the prior, that would indicate less balance. Now, because different leagues have different season lengths, that's going to affect our standard deviation of winning percentage. So the Knoll-Scully ratio actually compares the standard deviation to an ideal standard deviation. So how does the standard deviation in League X and Season Y compare to what the ideal standard deviation would be if we had good balance, right? And where that ideal comes from is we're not going to go into tons of detail there. But the idea here is that if you've got a league with 17 games, the NFL, we're going to expect to see a higher standard deviation in win percentages because by random chance, you're going to have that team that wins 16 games in a 17 game season, right? If you compare that to a sport like Major League Baseball where there are 162 games in a season, right? You're not going to see a team win 160 games in a 162 game season, right? So we would expect lower standard deviations in baseball because there are just so many games, right? Within a given season, a Major League Baseball team can go on a 17-game win streak, right, and still have a pretty moderate record. Within a given football season, if you win 17 games in a row, you're undefeated, right? And looking at competitive balance across some leagues, here we have two different seasons in the WNBA. Because the season length is the same, we could just compare the standard deviations, right? So if we look at the 2015 WNBA season compared to the 2018 WNBA season, we see that the standard deviation is lower in 2015 than it was in 2017, suggesting that 2015 had better balance, right? And if you just look at the individual records, right, the best team in 2015 won 23 games, the worst team won 8. In 2018, the best team won 26, the worst team won 6, right? So again, more balance in 2015 than 2018. That's represented by a lower standard deviation. Questions on that? Okay, cool. If we want to look across different sports, so which sports have the most balance, a lower ratio means more balance. So again, we're looking for a lower ratio for more balance. And if we're comparing sports here, we can see here that within the 2020-2021 season, the NFL, actually the Major League Soccer here had the best balance at a ratio of 1.29. I think the NBA here had the worst balance at 2.31. But again, we could compare across sports and see which leagues are relatively more or less balanced based on this ratio. Questions on this? All right, cool. Now, there are a number of ways that we could approach measuring inter-season balance or balance across seasons. One popular measure to do so is using the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which we actually stole from traditional economic measures of industry concentration. What the HHI does in economics, right, if you want to measure how concentrated an industry is, for example, you want to measure how concentrated the soda industry is. You take the market shares of each of the companies in the industry, you square those market shares and add. So if we were calculating the HHI for the soda industry, and suppose Coca-Cola has a 50% market share, Pepsi has a 35% market share, Dr. Pepper has a 15% market share, square those market shares and add them up, and you would get an HHI of 3950. HHI can vary from 0, which is perfect competition. No firm has any significant market share, to 10,000, which would be a monopoly. You have one firm with 100% market share. 100 squared is 10,000. So a value closer to 0 indicates more competitive. A value closer to 10,000 indicates less competitive. Questions so far? So to come back to a sports example here, we could calculate the HHI of team championships in a league, and we'll look at the case of the NFL from 2002 to 2021. From 2002 to 2021, across those 20 seasons, the Patriots won 6 championships. The Giants, Steelers, and Bucks each won 2, and then 8 other teams won 1, right? We could take that information to calculate the HHI for the NFL over that 20-year period. We would take the Patriots at 30% and square it, plus we had 3 teams at 10% and then 8 teams at 5%. If you go through and work out that math, that would be an HHI of 1,400, right? And again, if we're comparing 2 different leagues, a lower HHI means more competitive, a higher HHI means less competitive. Questions on that? And again, HHI, we're looking at balance across seasons. Again, this is inter-season balance. We can also calculate N-firm concentration ratios. Again, this is stolen from general economics as well. The N-firm concentration ratio is the percentage of the industry controlled by N firms, or the N largest firms. We could look at a 1-firm or a 3-firm or a 5-firm concentration ratio. If we look at the soda industry, the 1-firm concentration ratio in our last example is 50%, right? Coca-Cola had 50% of the market. Again, so 1 firm is the share of the biggest firm, 3-firm biggest 3, 5 firms biggest 5. If we look at the NFL example, the 1-firm concentration ratio over those last 20 seasons was 30%. The Patriots had the most championships, they won 30%. The 3-firm concentration ratio of 50% was Patriots at 30% plus the next 2 teams at 10% each. Right, so again, these N-firm concentration ratios just add up the shares of the biggest firms. Questions? And if we want to compare across our major sports leagues, how does inter-season balance compare? And here we're looking at, again, this 2001 to 2021 period. If we look at the NFL, and again, these are given in decimals. You can give those as like 0.140 would be 1,400 in our example. If we're looking across leagues here, what we see here is that Major League Baseball actually had the lowest HHI at 950 over that 20-year period. Amongst our North American sports leagues, the NFL, actually the WNBA was the worst in that period at 1450. If you look at soccer over in Europe, some of these HHIs are even worse, right? Bundesliga, the top team in Bundesliga won 14 of 20 championships for an HHI of 520. Similarly, like the English Premier League, pretty bad. Serie A, pretty bad too, right? You could also look at those concentration ratios. Again, 1-firm concentration ratio. Amongst our North American sports leagues, the worst was the NFL at 30%, right? If we look at these European soccer leagues, right, the top team in German soccer won 70% of games, or of championships, my apologies, right? 3-firm concentration ratio, you're adding those top 3 teams. Questions on this? So again, you can use HHI or concentration ratios to compare inter-season balance across these leagues. So a knowledge check question here, and I'll give you guys a little bit of time to do this. So suppose a league has 12 teams with the following distribution of championships over the past 10 seasons. 1 team won 4 of those 10 championships, 2 teams won 2 each, and then 2 teams won 1 each, while all other teams won 0. I want you to calculate the HHI and the 3-firm concentration ratios for that league. So take a couple of minutes. I don't care. You could work in small groups as you're doing this. Do those 2 calculations. Again, if you need some help on this, happy to walk around and help. Charlie can walk around and help too. Just raise a hand. All right, I'm going to bring us all back together up the front. Can I get a volunteer with answers? Going to have to give you a bonus point for a volunteer to answer to these two questions. Let's say that again. Not quite. Someone else. 2,600 sounds correct to me. How about the concentration ratio? Was that? Yeah, 0.8 or 80% absolutely. Yeah, so we'll go through and do those calculations together, but should have been 2,600 for the HHI and 80% or 0.8 for the concentration ratio. Bear with me while I pull open the whiteboard screen here. So doing those two calculations, so first HHI. In terms of our team winning percentages, we had teams that won 4, 2, 2, 1, 1, and a whole bunch of zeros in terms of wins. Turning those into percentages first, there were 10 total championships. So we had a team that won 4 out of 10 games, or championships, 2 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 1 out of 10, 1 out of 10, and a whole bunch of 0 out of 10s. So making those percentages, this was 40%, 20%, 20%, 10%, and 10%, and a whole bunch of 0%. For the HHI, we're going to take those raw numbers, square them, and then add them together. So in this case, we'd have 40 squared plus 20 squared plus 20 squared plus 10 squared plus 10 squared plus a whole bunch of zeros squared. I'm going to leave those alone. So that should be 1,600 plus 400 plus 400 plus 100 plus 100, which is where we get that 2,600 from. Questions on the math there? All right, cool. And then for the 3-firm concentration ratio, we're just going to add up the shares of the 3 winningest teams in this case. So this would be 40% plus 20% plus 20%, which gets us that 80% or 0.8. Questions on either of those two calculations? And again, you can certainly expect there to be one HHI calculation on the midterm. Yeah?
What if I want to calculate like four form concentration ratios like this, which there are like 2 teams.
Yep. Yeah, so bringing us back together, there's a good question here at the front of the room. So let me repeat that question in case you didn't hear it. So the question here at the front of the room was, what if we wanted to calculate a 4-firm concentration ratio, but there's a tie, right? So like in this case here, if we want to calculate a 4-firm concentration ratio, clearly number 1 won 40%, 2 and 3 both won 20%, 4 and 5 both won 10%, right? So there's a tie. It doesn't matter which of those 2 you pick since they're the same, right? Our 4-firm concentration ratio in this case is going to be our top 4 teams. Going to be the top 4 teams. Top team won 40%, second team won 20%, third team won 20%. And then our 4th best team did win 10%. Note there's a tie, but it doesn't really make a difference there. So in this case, a 4-firm concentration ratio would be 90%, right? Questions on this? So yeah, so if there's a tie, it doesn't matter which one is 4th. Either way, the 4th best was 10%. Yep. Other questions? All right, cool. Let me hop back to the slides. Oh, actually, apparently that was the last slide until